I'm making a video response to Professor Anton video. We'll just play some of this and I'll get to my point.
Because they feel themselves to be someone else. I think part of the question is, what is that? Now, if we're gonna say, if someone's gonna try to reduce it to an epistemological issue, and some person is either knowing the world falsely or more correctly, how exactly will you treat something like a religious experience? If the person is qualitatively happier with their life, if they're making more significant contributions to the larger world, if they feel...
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's all great. That's right. But it's all kind of how you define those that substance of that productivity. Your implication is that somebody has delusions, and those delusions, like they could think they're a superhero and they're doing good in the world or something, but maybe they're just causing more car accidents, and maybe they're causing more problems than they're solving or something like that. So it really depends on how you define what is being productive. And if you think good intentions are all you have to have, well, I'm going to argue, no, you have to have more than that. You have to demonstrate some sort of capacity to control circumstances, to understand mechanics, and to actually accomplish your task of whatever it is. If you want to play superhero, it would be preventing earthquakes, not cleaning up after them, that kind of thing. So, I mean, yes, I would concede that if somebody has a delusion, a false understanding, and that false understanding makes them more productive, great. But we know that's not how the real world works. That most delusions don't make people more productive, they make them destructive, because those delusions fundamentally break their understanding of how this game works, how the game is played, and what the values are. And so they misunderstand what's valuable, like a religious person who, say, for example, a Mother Teresa. They misunderstand what is valuable. They think serving God or doing what Jesus would Jesus do, or some kind of bullshit like that. What does the good book say? Instead of saying, well, these people dying on cement floors suffering for Jesus is a waste of suffering, and maybe we should give them some morphine instead of just praying over them, and that would be a lot more productive. So delusions can be very dangerous, and it's I just think it's wrong to sit there and imply something else. Alright, on the overall bigger picture subject, though, I'm going to go into a little bit of a long rant, I suppose. So, about the truth, right? Because that's what we're really talking about. Anton, Professor Anton, all these people, it's just about a theory of truth and understanding what it is that's taking place inside of our brains, what this experience is of being human, and what we should do with it. Whether we should just don't worry, be happy, always look on the bright side of life. Whether we should be doing that or doing that in a satirical way, saying, wait a minute, this is ludicrous, life is a piece of shit when you look at it, and maybe we should take that fact seriously and do something about it. So anyway, let's start from the beginning and just migrate ourselves through, and I'll, just imagine good video and little things happening, all kinds of interesting stuff, and graphics if you need them. Just imagine them, okay? We don't really need to make them, right? So just imagine there's... Okay, so we're talking about, we begin with the physics, okay? And it all starts with these things called photons, this stuff moving at the speed of light. And then it gets captured into things we call atoms or matter. And those are made up of, protons, neutrons, and electrons. Who cares? Doesn't matter what the bits are made out of. But what it basically is that light, those photons that are moving at the speed of light, get trapped in orbits. Orbits in the nucleus, orbits with the electrons, relationships with each other. But it's all basically photons. And the fundamental nature of the universe is creating little elements, we call them elements, Okay, there's a little over 100 of them that matter, and they're just basically atoms. Okay, they're basically just arrangements of photons, trapped in orbits, and they're trapped in different little configurations. Okay, some have, let's say 1 million photons in it. Another variety has 2 million, and then 3 million, then 5 million, then 15 million. So they're massive photons. E equals mc squared. Their energy component increases with their structural creation of a new shell, let's call it. They start with one shell, and they get another shell, and another shell, and another shell, and another shell, and do that 100 times, and you've got 100 different elements. So those elements bounce around in the universe. They're being created by stars right now. The stars are creating some of these elements through these nuclear processes, and they're getting bombarded by these photons still. And so there's photons hitting the atoms. The atoms are changing. They're being morphed from one form to another form. Lots of different kind of chemistries taking place, but it's all made out of these elements, these 100 elements. And they combine with each other because of the connections between these photons. When these photons are in little loops, they hook on each other, and they hook together, and then they become a molecule of some other compound, a compound, which is combining two elementary elements, two elementary atoms together, like carbon and oxygen, or oxygen and hydrogen to create water, that kind of thing. They stick to each other, and so now you have compounds, and you have almost an infinite variety of compounds that you can create, and that they can have all kinds of different structures. They can be made out of only two elements, let's say, but depending on how those two elements are arranged, it'll be ice, or it'll be water, or it'll be water vapor, and then you can get into all kinds of other hydrocarbons by adding a carbon. So you can have 3 simple elements, and then you have almost a ton of different kinds of substances that will be created with those 3 elements. And so in the universe, you have these big giant pieces of stuff floating around in the universe, but those big giant pieces are made out of these photons. It's just a bunch of photons that over time just keep collecting little pieces. The gravity pulls the stuff in as it gets more massive. It has more and more gravity, has more and more hooks, hooking more and more compounds into itself. And so that's a kind of chemistry going on in the big universe, where all the little photons are condensing into elements. They're being forced into atoms, so to speak. The photons are being forced to become atoms, and the atoms are massive, and they start sticking to each other, and they become denser and denser, and they become more and more of this matter stuff. So anyway, so that's one kind of chemical process, and we have lots of evidence that it doesn't do much, right? It just has a bunch of, yes, there's some interesting compounds out there. And the elements themselves are out there. You can go to another planet and it'll be just covered with methane or covered with some other chemistry. Lots of chemistry out there, but nothing really fancy, nothing doing anything, nothing going to wave at you or do anything interesting. But on planet Earth it got a little funky, because the chemistry, as it swirled around and sloshed around, it eventually got into a configuration that made its mechanics replicatable, which meant that it was started to make parts, and those parts interacted with each other. So through the design of this, double helix molecule, this this idea of having something replicating, it can copy itself merely by pulling it apart like a ladder, and the other rung to the ladder reforms on it. And that mechanism of reproduction led to, just through its mechanics, which you could take a couple of hours to go through all the mechanics that's built into that chemistry. But of course it had to, the initial phases were just splitting molecules, and the splitting molecules, the more they created certain chemistry, the more likely that chemistry was to replicate. So that became the code on the DNA molecule. The initial code was probably just making hardware that made the molecule replicate more efficiently, but it wasn't getting modified into something beyond that. And then eventually the molecule orchestrated became the constructor of an entire cellular membrane structure, and so that membrane, that structure itself divided. So now the molecule wasn't the only thing dividing. The molecule would divide, but the whole cell would divide with associated hardware. And it's through that process that it can initiate a much greater level of complexity could be acquired, as the code on the molecule decided what the structure of the vessel the molecule was hiding in would look like. And that's basically what still takes place. There's a DNA molecule hiding inside of you, okay? That is basically the thing, that the reason why you're here is that molecule. And all of this hardware is just a fancy membrane. It's just a fancy instrumentality to keep the molecule survivable, to keep it capable of replicating in the world. And you're just the vessel, the machinery, through which we'll accomplish that. You're its arms and legs, quite literally, and not much more. You're a machine, okay? And so through this evolution, the machine gained all these tools. Different machines have teeth, and they have a very aggressive digestive system, or they have a sticky tongue, or they have some other mechanism to make them more capable of spreading their DNA by surviving, by fighting off the other DNA molecules that are trying to consume the space they occupy, or consume the food they're eating. And this competition drives organisms to have to meet a standard defined by the environment. The environment tells you what tools you need, and if you don't have them, you're not going to succeed, and if you do have them, you'll succeed, and that's basically the game. So the machinery creates lots of different varieties, and a small minority of the varieties created will be deemed successful in the competition by out-surviving the others, by gladiator warring them into the dirt and claiming its prize of playing the game another round. And so it's through all these millions of rounds, millions of rolls of the reproductive mutation dice, building more and more tools, building more and more instrumentality, merely out of random changes, and just accepting, just keeping the good changes. Just like breeding puppies or something. You could breed puppies, and you could make a standard where you say, I'll kill all the puppies that don't have a spot on their forehead. So the only ones with spots on their forehead are the ones you keep. And yeah, that's biology. That's the game of selection. And nature's doing a selection process based on environmental standards, not arbitrary spot on the head standards. And so anyway, the tool game goes on, and it's all made out of that chemistry stuff, those photons. It's still just photons, caught up in atoms, atoms sticking to each other because they have an affinity for each other, because their shapes are the right shapes, and they hook on to each other. And that's all that's taking place. So underneath it all, there's still just photons spinning about. Really simple parts. It's all just tinker toys. It's all just dominoes. It's made out of something very simple, but it has a very interesting pattern. It's the pattern it's being filtered by this evolution mechanism. And so now these biological organisms are now creating all kinds of chemistry, all chemistry that could never possibly exist, except it had to be manufactured by some sort of organism that could go through the stages of the process to manufacture the chemistry. So we have lots of interesting chemistry around us that wouldn't be possible to exist if it wasn't for the fact that we have become complex chemical engines and complex behavior engines now that you give us the tool of neurology. So the first neurology was just simple reflexes. You hit the organism on one end and it shoots poop out of its other end. That kind of simple stuff, and then that came, the development of those reflexes became more and more sophisticated, and that became our senses, our sight, our sound, to taste, touch, they're just reflexes. But now they've become reflexes that trigger reflexes that trigger reflexes that trigger reflexes that trigger reflexes, and essentially has become a more complex thing we might call a program, like in computer science. It's all just a reflex. It's all just taking a bit out of a memory location and putting it in another location based on a rule that's established, and we're doing the same thing. If this, do that, and that's all that's happening. So if something triggers this, then something else does that, and that's all there is. But there's a ton of it. Millions and millions of reactions that create every bit of our behavior. And so built into that mechanism, now you have these organisms that have become very complex, and so they have this sense data that comes in, and they can just reflexively react to it, or as it happened with sentient organisms, they can have the input come in. It can create a complex reaction to it and create what is a sensation, a blending of all the senses together in one location, in one place, and this thing called a sensation happens, a feeling that's either negative or positive, either comforting or discomforting. I guess I would argue that it's probably just discomfort. There's just levels of discomfort, and when you take away discomfort, it appears comforting. But anyway, so that's where it fell on this mechanism of creating the repulsive sensation. And with that repulsive sensation, it can now associate sense data that comes in and create the idea of fear, or run away or get away. And that would make the organism more effective at surviving, because now it could associate things, it could recognize things in the environment and react to them based on a perception created inside of its head. So now it has one brain that's taking in the data. It creates a sensation, which creates a problem for the organism, like I have to do something. I either desire or I'm afraid. Either I'm attracted or repulsed. And I can be both at the same time. I can be hungry and afraid. And that makes me have to process, do more work. So instead of just being a knee-jerk organism, I can be an organism that can have two different interests, hungry and afraid. And now my brain can move around, look around, and say, can I get rid of the fear or can I get rid of the hunger? Can I satisfy one of these things without compromising myself? And if it can't, well, then it's going to have to keep studying until it can find some way to either appease its fear or satisfy its hunger, and that became the more complex organism. So essentially what human beings are doing is they're taking in, the mammals, what mammals are doing is they're taking in the world through their senses. Their senses are creating a narrative, a story of sorts, a representation of reality that has a feeling component tied to it of comfortable or discomfortable, I like it, I dislike it, a taint to it, a feeling taint. And then their brain has a memory of those feelings, of those images, of those things, and it looks in the memory and says, has this happened before? Is there a past experience? What did we do the last time we were in this position? And then it can learn. It can become a learning machine. And so we learn like a wolf can learn how to navigate its territory. It knows where the trees are, so now it can run really fast, and it has like an automatic physical reflex, a memory, a muscle memory. And so now it's going to be even better at catching its food because it can remember how to jump the environment. It can remember where the stream is and where the gully is and where the rock is and where that tree is, and it can avoid all the hazards and more efficiently navigate the environment through that muscle memory. And then for humans it became more complicated because they started associating vocabulary, words, as representations of things. And so then we gained more and more vocabulary, more and more symbolic representation. We basically turned it into a process where we could define the properties of things. We knew that rocks were hard and trees were, that they got bigger over time, and that the ground changed, and the water was, sometimes when it rained there was more water in the stream. We could understand all those things conceptually, because we can understand the properties of things, and we could put things in categories. We could put things in categories of good or bad or comfortable or uncomfortable or dangerous or not dangerous or all of that crap. Choke. So, I think I'll be okay. So we're almost to the end. So anyway, that's what language became. It's just having a. At first, it was just raw data, raw information, like a punch in the face or something. The first words were probably just pretty much, very aggressive, words that you can almost say with your face. They were obvious expressions. And eventually there was this Helen Keller moment for the human race where it acquired enough words where it could understand, now I can put these words together as a complete picture of reality, and now I can start describing things in a more complete way, because now I have enough words to describe the idea that it moves, or that it changes, or that it ages, or that it changes color, or all of the different things could do, and now I can describe them with words instead of just being stuck with one word. Let's just say rock, and there's all kinds of different rock. There's rock hanging over your head, there's big rock, there's little rock. There's all kinds of different ways to interact with something that might be called rock. And so that's when language became so much more powerful, is when we had enough words, enough categories to be able to really describe things as they fit into the entire game. So it was like understanding chess. You can understand on a crude level that, okay, there's some pieces that seem very disposable and the other pieces seem more important. Or you could understand it on this higher level where you understand exactly how each piece moves. Then you could even understand on a higher level, which would be the abstraction, that there's whole entire strategies about how you configure the pieces in certain ways to make them less vulnerable and make yourself less capable of losing, that kind of thing. And we are doing the same thing in how we navigate the environment. We're learning our limitations as well as as we gain control. But the bottom line is we're just we're functioning mostly as an animal. We came from animal. The animals were driven by desire for food, and the sexual or social desires that are fundamental to your liberty to replicate. Mostly controlled with most mammals by some sort of social hierarchy. Your success, in terms of it as an individual, is really going to be dependent on your status within the group, not so much your capacity to survive in the wild, so to speak. You might be a very good survivor, but if you're not a good politician, you might fail in many mammalian social groups, because the game is really becoming the leader of the group and using the group as your weapon, as another membrane of your DNA molecule. And that's how many mammals function, essentially, as the dominant hierarchy alpha male is basically using the other members of the troop to create a shield of power for its molecule, protecting its molecule and giving its molecule capacity to spread. And so it's almost another layer of its flesh, is how it controls its family unit, or its tribe, or its nation, or its race, or whatever you want to go through, all those kind of levels of manipulation and influence. So, but bottom line is the initiative, the sensations all come out of the individual. The welfare state is still within the individual. The individual will experience the unpleasant sensations, the pain, suffering, torment, torture. These are all things that will be manifest in the individual and their only function is in terms of the biological imperative. Their origin is in the biological imperative of survivability and replication of the molecule. We're all descendant individually from successful organisms who survived the game long enough to produce prodigy, who played the politics adequately, and that's the nature. That's of the nature of the reality of all of our existences. We're 4 billion. We've survived our DNA 4 billion years of gladiator war. And so, yeah, we're one hell of a machine, but that's all we are. And the thoughts that run through people's heads, the delusional stories about unicorns or gods or, other ego mechanisms are just that. They're just fairy tales and fables. The real story is you're just a replicating molecule. You're a tool-enabled machine of chemistry, a complex arrangement of chemistry forced together. The chemistry has been forced together. My liver doesn't work for my body because it wants to. It's been forced into servitude. The cells, the atoms, the molecules, the photons have been captured and compelled to be part of this arrangement because of the way the DNA molecule replicates, and the fact that the replications that survive, the machines that survive, replicate a certain kind of molecule, and it will force the same kind of slavery all over again. Because that kind of slavery worked. That kind of forcing of the chemistry together worked. And that's the game we're caught up in. But it's just a bunch of chemistry blobbed together to make a machine that survives in the environment. And as intelligences, we can understand this is the game. We can understand that it's really expensive, and that there actually are no players. It's just pieces, knocking pieces off the board because a DNA molecule required it, and there's nothing else happening here. There is going to be no winner of the game. There's just going to be pieces disposed of over and over and over and over again forever, and some of these pieces will delude themselves with fantastic stories that I won, when no, they basically enslaved a bunch of organisms through a hierarchy and abused the fuck out of them for their comfort. Just like right now I'm breathing oxygen and living in a temperate environment created by the suffering of a bunch of sentient organisms dying to create a humus from which the rest of the biosphere creates the things I live on. I'm forcing their parasitic slavery. I'm forcing them to be ground up in the game for eternity to satisfy my comfort. And that's all there is here. There's just stuff to consume. Okay? Consumption, reproduction, it's all kind of cannibalistic, and it's all because you're psychologically motivated, addicted by a mechanism that creates this as the agenda. And certainly we can logically understand that the agenda of the crude machine should not be the agenda of the thinking, capable, logical device that has been placed on top of this toolkit. And it's capable now of, instead of being owned by the gorilla, the iPod, the thinking machine, the weapon of logic, can now understand that it should be in control, that it should be defining the goals, that it shouldn't be a slave to the silly notions of a biological machine. Probably enough. Yeah, but there's always, but this is it, okay? That's the story. That's the truth. That's the reality we're living in. There are no unicorns. There are no gods. There are no accomplishments beyond the fact of how you affect the other sentient things existing here. There's nothing else going on here. There's just biological machines capable of feeling who are feeling. and that's the only part that has any meaning, then the rest of it is just machines. It's just mechanisms banging into each other, and it's of no consequence. And the only part of it that has any meaning, that there's any rational reason to apply logic to, is the dilemma of the repulsive sensation that has been manifest in the conscious organism. That's probably enough. It is the source of all value. There's no other mechanism creating value except sentient organisms. No other thing makes value coins. Yeah, that's really enough. So, roll the credits and whatever, some kind of whatever smiley face image.